Welcome to the 8th online talk sponsored by Rowntree Tryon Galleries. With the support of Jamie Rowntree, we've been able to put on this series of talks for free and to reach a wider audience beyond our membership. Welcome to everybody. And can I take this opportunity to encourage any non-members to join us as we continue to promote all aspects of sporting art. Today, I welcome our first international speaker, Anna Tietze from South Africa. Good morning, Anna, in Cape Town. I hear it's a lot warmer there than it is over here, where we have a foggy morning. Anna's going to talk about the Abe Bailey Bequest, an outstanding collection of British sporting art held in the South African National Gallery at Cape Town. I'm sure everybody who went on the BSAT trip to South Africa in 2006 will agree that it is a fantastic collection of British sporting art. Anna was born and educated in Britain. After graduating from Oxford and Essex universities, she moved to South Africa, where she has taught for many years as a senior lecturer in art history at the University of Cape Town. In addition to her university work, Anna has been in a long-standing professional collection with the South African Gallery. She has curated exhibitions there on the institution's pre-war gift collections and has published on these, both for a gallery audience and in academic journals. In 2017, her history of the gallery, the first full-length history of the institution, was published by the University Press. Anna's curated 2 exhibitions based on the Abe Bailey Bequest. They were in 2001 and 2008. For the second, she produced a complete catalogue, raisonné, of the collection, which is a fantastic record of the contents of that collection. And she also produced a comprehensive website. Today's presentation draws on that research. So without much ado, over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you for this opportunity of talking about the collection. Am I clear? Is my voice clear?
Yes, yes.
Good. Right, I'll proceed. So the Sir Abe Bailey Bequest, A Gift of British Sporting Art for South Africa is my title, and I thought that I would divide this brief talk into 3 little sections. First of all, say something about Abe Bailey himself and the beginnings of his collecting, and then move on to look a little at some of the works in the collection, and then finish up with a short, broad overview of the reception of the collection since it arrived in the gallery. So Abe Bailey, first of all, born in 1864 in South Africa, but of British parents. He was born into a fairly humble family. And after the early death of his mother, he was sent to school in England. He spent some 10 years there and then returned as a young man to South Africa in the early 1880s. This was the decade in which the South African gold rush was beginning. Gold and diamonds had been discovered on the Rand, as it's called, that northern area of South Africa around Johannesburg. And Abraham Bailey soon became aware of the possibilities there and travelled up to Kimberley and to Johannesburg to make his fortune. Over the course of the next 10 years, by the late 1890s, he'd done just that. He'd become a part of the circle of Cecil John Rhodes, and he had acquired substantial interests in gold mining and financing in particular, becoming the head of what came to be called the Bailey Group of gold mines. He also acquired substantial land interests in both South Africa and in what was then Southern Rhodesia, then Rhodesia, and nowadays, of course, Zimbabwe. So by the turn of the century, he was already a wealthy man, and he was established as one of those so-called landlords, as they're nicknamed, those mining magnates who made their fortunes in late 19th century South Africa. And like his fellow landlords, people such as Julius Werner and Alfred Beit, Bailey celebrated his wealth by buying himself a substantial home in London in 38 Bryanston Square, no longer in existence. It was bombed badly during the Second World War. He also had a home in East Grinstead in Surrey, and in South Africa, which he came to for roughly 6 months of each year thereafter. He took over the lovely Herbert Baker home in Muizenberg, which is a coastal suburb of Cape Town, just down the road from where I'm talking now. After Rhodes died in 1902, Bailey took over this house, which was being designed, in fact, for Rhodes himself to live in. He also had a home in the Northern Cape, in the Karoo, which is the semi-desert area of the Cape. And that was a farm, a very substantial farm, where he engaged in a really major process of sheep breeding and horse breeding also. He raced his horses very successfully in both South Africa and in England. He had a number of horses too that he raced in Great Britain each year. And so he lived this peripatetic life between these two countries. And like so many of his fellow landlords, he dedicated a part of his wealth to the building up of an art collection. Now, he had a collection both in South Africa and in his London home seen here on the left, but the London collection was the far more substantial one, and it's the one that I'm going to be talking about today. This collection comprised nearly 400 works, two-dimensional paintings and works on paper. And it was rich in portraits of 18th and 19th century portrait painters, but it was particularly rich in sporting art. Sporting art is makes up the majority of this collection. And to give you an idea of the numbers, there are approximately 140 paintings, sporting art paintings in this collection, and again, approximately 140 painting prints and works on and drawings. By the 1930s, Bailey was being dogged by ill health and began to write his will. And the question was, what should he do with his collection? He approached a number of British galleries with the view to bequeathing it to them, and nobody was interested. And so he turned instead to South Africa's National Gallery, which, after some discussion, gladly accepted this gift. So when Bailey died in 1940, the war, of course, had just recently broken out, and it wasn't possible to ship the collection at that time. It was shipped over in 1946 and 1947, and the gallery in Cape Town, the South African National Gallery, as it was called by this time, suddenly found itself with this fabulous collection of sporting art and English portraiture. Bailey's collecting was all in the field of English art. There were very, very few foreign works in his collection. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the works in this collection. The collection is rich chronologically in terms of its scope, although it needs to be pointed out that it doesn't have many of the very early practitioners. It doesn't have Wootton, it doesn't have Seymour, for example. It's got a couple of nice Benjamin Marshalls, and I show one of them here, the old favourite from 1801. A work which, it has to be said, is formidably difficult to reproduce in photographic form. So this rather strange reproduction we have here doesn't do justice to it. But it gives some sense of the chronological sweep of this collection, which gives a very nice overview of the 19th century school. And goes up to the work of Alfred Munnings. There are 3 works by Munnings in the collection. They're all works commissioned by Bailey, of the artist, to depict 3 of his favourite horses, horses that had been very successful in English races. This one, Son-in-Law, dates from 1927. And what this little juxtaposition does too, rather nicely, is just remind us of the great stylistic shift that occurs in this genre of art over the period of time from the late 18th up until the early 20th century, where that dark, somber tonality of the early days gave way to the Impressionists-inspired blonde lighting that informs Munning's works, a quite different attitude towards the painting of the outdoors and of the sky and of light is seen in the later work. As well as being broad chronologically, the collection is also very diverse in terms of the various sub-themes that it deals with. And one of the ones that it's particularly rich in is what I, in my catalogue, dubbed horse portraiture. I'm not sure if other people call it that too, but it seems to me a good term for this very interesting subset of sporting art, where a thoroughbred that the owner is particularly proud of is commemorated, standing proudly in the center of a picture. This one by Abraham Cooper, The Day Family, is a particularly interesting example of the genre. The Day Family of the title shrink almost to the left of the picture space. What we see here is Mr. and Mrs. Day, son Day, and daughter-in-law in the carriage. And they're in a carriage with a rather humble little pony pulling it, eyes blinkered, almost symbolically, as if this little specimen of the horse at the left-hand side can't possibly compete with the magnificent venison, as he's called, who stands tall in the middle, jockey astride him. So here, the human, who is normally the subject of portraiture, gives way to, metaphorically moves to one side, and the splendid horse is given pride of place instead. Perhaps the best examples, certainly the most valuable examples in the collection of these horse portraits are three beauties by George Stubbs. And Bailey was well aware of just how beautiful and valuable these were. His son recorded that he called them the apple of his eye. Firetail with his trainer, Rosaletta, set stark against that emptied landscape, and two bay hunters by a tree, bottom right. These are all marvelous examples of the genre, and Stubbs at his very finest, producing those almost abstract versions of the horse portrait that he was famous for. He empties his landscape almost altogether of distracting information, and he strategically places the horse very often so that a crucial part of it is right at the center of the picture. You might notice this with the two bay hunters at the bottom. He minimally distracts us with anything else by way of plant life or human activity. And instead we focus on this extremely abstracted structure of the horse body, with in some cases, a small and insignificant human at its side or astride it. So this is a really interesting artistic experimentation with a genre which was being done time and time again, and which required a real genius such as Stubbs to make of it something really artistically fascinating. Let's just take an example of Stubbs in comparison with another fine painter of the horse. Here's Charles Town, who started off very humbly, as some of you might know, as a wagon painter, but soon began to produce very interesting examples of this horse portraiture. And this lovely example of the grey hunter here is a beautiful example of its kind, but so very different from Stubbs's Rosaletta. They're not so different in terms of time of production, but very, very different in terms of what the artist is trying to do. So Town, massing up a dark landscape behind this brightly lit horse, gives us a sense of a sort of turbulence, a tension in the air. The horse looks expectantly towards a lighted area to its left, and the horse is made into a kind of personification of a nervous anticipation. There's a poetry in Charlestown which is almost literary in its redoing of this kind of portraiture. Stubbs, by contrast, is all calmness and stasis. There's a minimal amount of emotion, and instead, and I come back to this concept of the abstract, there's this sense of great abstract simplicity. So two very different artists working variations on this theme. So we've looked at some of the horse portraits. Let me just take you through just a couple of other examples of works in the collection, other themes that are dealt with, plenty of images of hunting, both fox hunting, and there's an interesting example of a Wolstenholme stag hunt also, which I haven't included here. Plenty of examples of coaching. Plenty of examples too of game shooting, of fishing, of racing. So all of the little subsets of this genre are well represented in the collection. And I can't resist showing you this beautiful little work by John Herring, produced late in his life, of the doe, the female hare with her young, surrounded by the vegetables, and in its original lovely frame, exhibited at the British Institution in 1864. In fact, one of the last years before that annual exhibition came to an end later in the 1860s. So in looking at the horse portrait, I've been trying to come to grips with how interesting much of this sporting art is when looked at with the art historian's eye as works of interesting play with style. Perhaps a more common way of approaching sporting art is often what I would call the sociological approach instead, where the works are embedded in a study of the social history of the times and seen as interesting documents of what life was like in the 19th century or whenever. And of course, this is a very fruitful line of inquiry, and it's one that one can pursue very usefully with the works that we see here. James Pollard is well represented in the collection with a number of coaching works that he became famous for, particularly in the period from about 1820 to 1840, when his career was really flourishing. And this image of the London to Cambridge coach taking on passengers gives us a lovely insight into life in London and the business of the coaching trade at the time. And in a very different way, the John Fernley work at the top, and it's a large work, a really magnificent work, is one of the works commissioned by Thomas Ashton Smith, who was one of Fernley's first patrons, and is a marvelous boast on the part of the patron and the artist about who Ashton Smith was and what his achievements were. We see him here with the Tedworth estate, Tedworth House in the distance. It was a house that he just recently inherited from his father. And there in the background, we can hardly ignore it, but it's only discreetly cited there. In the foreground and swarming around Smith on horseback are the hounds for which he became famous. He bred hounds very successfully. And then, of course, we might too notice the magnificent costume that Smith is dressed in, which is that tight fitting costume, which had taken over from the looser garb of earlier, of the late 18th century and the very beginning of the 19th. And this tighter fitting costume, of course, interestingly, is partly inspired by the city dress of people like Beau Brummel, who was advocating a tight dandyish costume for men. This passes through to this hunting gear. So that is the sorts of comments that I've made here about Fearnley and Pollard are, of course, comments which are pointing out the sociological interest of these very British pieces of art, the way they relate to British history. But it might be said, of course, well, this is absolutely fascinating if you're in Britain, but what if you're 6,000 miles away in the tip of Africa, in South Africa, in Cape Town? What possible relevance, to use that dreaded term, can this have for a South African audience? And this brings me to the third and final part of this talk, which is the reception of this collection when it came to South Africa. So the gallery that it came to is this one seen here, which had only opened 16 years earlier in 1930, when the works finally arrived. It was a very new building, but the gallery itself pre-existed this building. But it was the gallery that pre-existed this building was a very modest one, which had occupied just 2 rooms of the nearby South African Museum, which is just down the road from this gallery. So the holdings of the National Gallery, even by 1930, were extremely modest. They were particularly meager in terms of great European art. And so when a benefactor like Abe Bailey came along to the gallery in the 1930s and proposed giving his large collection of British art to this institution, it enthusiastically accepted. But when it actually arrived just after the war, interesting conflicts were beginning to emerge. And really, these conflicts are ones that have never gone away. Basically, the 2 issues that have bedeviled the galleries and the public's relationship to the Bailey collection since it arrived are the issues of nationalism and whether a national gallery should showcase national art rather than international art on the one hand. And secondly, the question of international modernism and whether a national gallery should be showcasing the finest of contemporary art, or whether it should be giving a heavy focus to art of the past. And that bleeds into the larger question of quality. Do so-called minor masters justify a large place in a national gallery, especially if they're not even masters of that gallery's own country? So from the moment the collection arrived, in the press and even grumblings within the gallery itself were being heard about whether this collection belongs in South Africa. What does a collection of very British art, talking about British aristocrats, talking about British coaching traditions, talking about British rural sports, what does that have to do with us in South Africa? And one needs to remember too that 2 years after the collection first arrived in 1948, the nationalist government came to power. That government was the one that brought in the notorious system of apartheid. That was the government of Afrikaners, of those Dutch and German descendants who, especially since the Boer War, were no friends of the British. So in this time, in this turbulent time in South Africa's own political life, the Bailey collection raised these questions about relevance and about national identity. And they were a major problem in the 1950s. I should just mention that one of the particular problems for the collection was that in Bailey's will, he requested that the collection be shown in its entirety and at all times. And astonishingly, for some reason, this was signed off on. It seems, there's no written record, but it seems as if within about 4 years of it arriving in the gallery, It wasn't being shown any longer in its entirety. But the disputes carried on. Why are we seeing so many of these works in a gallery in South Africa? Another kind of issue arose in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s even, and that was the question of whether the National Gallery shouldn't be showing more of modern developments in art. The gallery was by now being run by people who were very interested in what was coming out of America and of all the abstract experiments of contemporary art. And they were feeling that this large sporting art collection was out of place for a different reason now, not because it represented a different nation altogether, but because it represented a rather minor art of the past, which no longer had relevance in a brave new age. Now, interestingly, it was really only in the 1990s that things began to change. So a very long period of time had passed during which this collection was being quite negatively reported on. And I mustn't overplay this. I mean, parts of it were being shown throughout this time, but that was a legal requirement. But it didn't have strong supporters. But in the late 80s, early 90s, the issue of museology, of the history of collections, of the history of collecting as a phenomenon became academically very fashionable. And I found myself finding this subject very interesting. Why do people collect? Why do private collectors collect? Why do public collections buy the works that they do? What is the history of these collections? What's the motivation for them? So this is, if you like, a kind of sociology of collecting. What is this thing that humans do that they call art collecting? And with that sort of interest in collecting as a phenomenon, the Bailey collection could be seen anew as something with great historical interest. One man, Bailey, fervently collected this work and loved the works that he'd collected. Galleries that he'd have tried to offer it to in Britain didn't want it. Why not? The gallery in South Africa in the 1930s accepted it. Why was that? And why did it then have a mixed press ever since? So these were interesting questions to do with the business of collections as a whole. And so it was armed with that kind of interest in collecting as an activity that I approached the gallery in the late 1990s and asked if they would be prepared to let me curate an exhibition of this large collection, which, as far as I can make out, hadn't been seen in its entirety since around 1950, extraordinarily. And I was helped by the fact that in the early 1990s, a new and dynamic director had taken over at the gallery, a woman called Marilyn Martin. And she was very open to the idea of looking at the gallery's collecting past. I'd already worked under the aegis of her directorship, as it were, on two previous occasions when I'd curated two other earlier gift collections to the gallery, which had come to it in the first half of the 20th century. So this one that arrived in the 1940s was the next one to look at. And I was allowed to put on a fairly substantial exhibition in 2001. But I felt that there was so much that this exhibition had to leave out that I requested, after it had come off, and it would have been very popular, that I put on a complete show of the whole collection. Again, Marilyn Martin agreed to this, and this is what took place in 2008. And I'll show you some pictures here, not terribly wonderful reproductions of what was quite a considerably large exhibition of the works on paper too, which had been particularly underexposed. And And it was this exhibition that was accompanied by the complete catalogue that Tim showed us at the outset. So this exhibition was opened right at the end of 2008. And the idea was that it would stay on for a year and come down at the end of 2009. But the tenure of Marilyn Martin came to an end at the end of 2008. She was ready for retirement. And in 2009, there was a rather sort of fallow period at the gallery when nobody was in charge. But by 2010, right at the beginning of that year, they had a new director in place, a man called Riazan Naidu. Now, the idea was that because a director hadn't been found immediately to take over from Marilyn Martin the year after she left, the exhibition would stay on just a little longer, just because the administration of the gallery was in a bit of a state of flux. So when the new director took over, seen here, at the beginning of 2010, the Bailey retrospective was still there. It had now been up just over a year, and it was taking up a large part of the gallery space, 2 or 3 rooms of it. Riazan Naidu, this was the 2010, the year of the World Cup being held in South Africa. He wanted to make a splash by putting on a big retrospective of South African art. And he looked aghast at the Bailey exhibition and thought, what's this doing here in this, my country of South Africa? This is British art, it doesn't belong, and it's art of the distant past. I want to get rid of it. And he made the assumption, as far as I know in good faith, he assumed this was true, that the work had always been on the walls, as opposed to being up there just for a year. At least this was the message he put out into the press, that the gallery, a South African National Gallery, was being dominated by British art, and that this was just a symptom of the old colonial attitudes that pervaded institutions like this gallery, that he was dedicated to transforming. So you find, British newspapers like The Guardian splashed scary articles about the fact that this Bailey exhibition, this Bailey work was taking up so much space and was just symptomatic of the wrong sort of attitude at the gallery. It was all entirely inaccurate, of course. This was only ever meant to be a temporary exhibition. And in fact, it was an exhibition of work that had scarcely been seen at all in the previous 60 years. But such is media spin. So the works were all removed in order for Naidu to put on this show called From PNF to Gugulective. PNF is a famous South African artist of the early 20th century. The Gugulective is an art collective based in outside of Cape Town. Naidu himself moved on in time. His contract wasn't renewed after 2015 because he made a number of enemies, partly. But the Bailey works weren't, of course, returned to the walls. And on subsequent visits to the gallery, they remained in the storeroom largely. So the story at present, and with all the disruptions of COVID, is that the large collection of sporting art that Bailey donated all of those years ago looks likely to be somewhat obscured again as the forces of nationalism have returned in full force, now under the aegis of the concept of anti-colonialism. And who knows really what the future might hold. Just anecdotally, the person I also dealt with, apart from Marilyn Martin at the gallery, was the head of, not the head of, was one of the Bailey trustees, because I should mention that the collection is held in trust by a Bailey Trust, and it is looked after legally by the gallery. That that active member of the Bailey Trust who helped to facilitate all of these exhibitions too, for me, has now died. And so key people who were instrumental in helping me to curate these exhibitions and keep the collection prominent are now no longer here. And its future looks a little bit bleak. And on that rather sad and pessimistic note, I'm sorry, I will finish and wait for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. The wide-ranging exposition of the collection. And it's interesting to see how this collection has been at the center of cultural debate right from the inception, since it was received.
Yes.
Through all aspects of South African politics. I think it's almost a flashpoint for the discussion.
Yes.
Right at the beginning, you mentioned that there was a South African collection as well. I think this is all the pictures that you're showing from the British side of his collection. What was going on in South Africa? Did he have a sporting art collection?
No, he didn't. No, that's an interesting thing. He had a little collection in his Muizenberg home, that town home that I showed you at the beginning. It was much more modest. It was valued at his death at, I think it was £2,000, where the English collection was valued at 30,000. And it was smaller too in terms of numbers of works. And that was largely made up of what's called Africana. In other words, prints and drawings very often by minor artists, very often traveller artists who made their name in South Africa alone. I'm thinking of people like Thomas Baines and Thomas Bowler, not major names. So that was dispersed by auction in 1951 and made a little more money than its initial valuation, but not tremendously much more.
One of the things that struck me in going through the catalogue was how wide the subject matter is, both portraits from Gainsborough, Romney, Rayburn, and sporting pictures. And again, a wide range of sporting pictures, subjects and artists. Could you work out what his collecting policy was? It just seemed so wide.
So Catholic, yes, yes, indeed. Well, you know, those portraits, and you see them in this picture here, a few of them, but I unfortunately didn't have time to show them. Portraiture of the 18th and 19th century British school was beloved of American collectors as well as South African ones and British ones, of course. So you find many of those famous collectors like Samuel Frick, for example, buying English portraits, probably because it established a sense of their own young country having a heritage. It was like buying into a past that they didn't personally own. So he wasn't unusual in buying portraits of this school. This was sort of, as it were, a de rigueur part of collecting of that time. The sporting art part of it seems to have been collected simply because he loved that world. He loved the world of the countryside and of farming. He talked of himself as being a man of the soil. Of being a down-to-earth person. So rather like Paul Mellon, all those years later, Paul Mellon commented on how he and his wife collected down the byways of art. They collected minor masters who documented a life that they just loved. So they weren't snobbishly concerned with whether these artists had high status. And the same seems to have been true of Bailey, that he was collecting these sporting pictures because it represented a world that he loved and identified with. The portraiture was a rather different business.
Did he collect in mind for future display in terms of wanting a representative collection of sporting art? Or is that something that emerged later once he'd got the collection?
Yeah, well,
I'm collecting the books here, but almost for the future as much as I am for immediate use and pleasure.
Yes. Well, look, one doesn't know. There's very little recorded commentary. There's very little recorded on him generally. His son produced an unpublished biography after his death, but there are very few other first-hand records of what Bailey said and what he thought that he was doing with his collection. My sense is that it was rather more haphazard than that he wasn't particularly trying to get representative examples of key figures, that he was buying as things came along. He was being advised by Martin Leggett of Leggett Brothers in London, and it would be interesting to pursue that further. But Leggett Brothers no longer exists, and their records, as far as I can see, aren't in existence. So I haven't been able to pursue that. But Bailey certainly didn't regard himself as a sort of intellectual collector. So I suspect he wasn't taking a view to posterity when he was collecting.
I've had a question in. Does the South African National Gallery policy or attitude to foreign art extend to other countries, or is it just British, an attitude towards British?
You mean this sort of ambivalence?
For example, there's a lot of European Renaissance art, I think, in the gallery. Do they, or held by the gallery, do they have the same attitude towards?
Well, they that hasn't met with a very sort of favourable response either. Often, they historically have been happy about Dutch art being shown in South Africa as representative of South African culture. Because of course the Afrikaner population identifies with the Netherlands. But I think the issue with Britain is that it has been seen as the oppressive colonial power. And even now, although much larger tribal differences, if you like, are in play, there's still a sort of friction between English and Afrikaners in this country. So something that is quintessentially British, quintessentially English, as most of these are, is certainly going to touch a particular nerve.
Right. So it is the Britishness as much as the sporting side that's the issue.
Yes. Yeah, it's an interesting question, that how you would rank those two criteria. Yes, I think the enmity was felt too towards the portraits as well, in equal measure. Although in the case of the portraits, because they were by big name artists, that helped to convince some people that they had value. But when it was felt that these were works by minor artists who very often hadn't received any official kind of training and who were documenting something that was so closely connected with British culture in particular, there seemed to be very little on which to hang an excuse for their being in South Africa.
Is the family still involved with the collection, and do they have any influence? And
yes.
add a slightly other question: what do you think's the future of the collection?
The family does. There is a well-known Cape Town artist called Abe Bailey, who is a son of Bailey, and who occasionally raises a protest about how it's being ignored. And on the body of the trustees, when I was involved with them, there was another family member who didn't live in Cape Town, but occasionally came to visit. Yeah, only Abe Bailey lives in Cape Town, and I sense that the pressure on the gallery might wane a little. To answer your second question, what's going to happen? Oh, I don't know. It's part of a larger question as to what's going to happen to the gallery generally, because just to go back to this issue of attitudes towards European, non-South African art, there's such a very, very strong anti-colonial and more generally anti-European feeling here culturally now at the moment, that the gallery is in a precarious position because it does have quite large holdings of European art and of some American art, but it needs somebody to be convinced that has an equal right to be shown.
So the cultural debates will continue.
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, you'll be aware of it in Britain. The enormous cultural revolutions that are taking place in universities and in places like museums and art galleries. The questioning of what their function is, what they should be teaching, what students should be learning. It's huge. I'm tremendously aware of it. You walk a bit of a minefield, and of course the gallery is no less than the university dealing with these sorts of questions. And it doesn't help that under the new management structure at the museums of Cape Town, which it's the amalgamated museums of Cape Town are called ASICO museums. So this is now called the ASICO South African National Gallery. And each of these museums no longer has their own dedicated director. They are run by somebody who is above all of them. And that doesn't bode well too for a vision for the future of an institution like the gallery, in my view.
Well, Anna, I'd like to thank you for the time you've spent with us this morning.
Thank you.
You've managed, I think, quite well to go through the cultural debates that have been going on and sound fairly neutral in your description of them. I'm sure there are difficult aspects of the debate that you have to circumnavigate or
yes.
discuss. Art history courses must be much more lively than they were in the past.
Yes, I suppose that's something.
So thank you very much for joining us this morning. Much appreciated. And thank you for answering the questions that we've had.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed it. And
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just to sum up, we continue this series of lectures. We've scheduled more until March. We're working on the programme that goes beyond March, and would welcome any comments of what anybody's heard over this series to date, and whether there are any suggestions of future speakers. But as I say, we are planning that programme now. So thank you very much, everybody who joined us. I think a great start to 2022 and the debate about sporting art and its role, and a subject that we all enjoy. It's been a pleasure to hear you from the sunny side of the world.
It is indeed.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Sally. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Just before we go, can I just remind everybody that the next talk is on the 17th of February, and it's on the Glasgow artist Josie Crawhall by the curator at Glasgow Museums. which holds the largest collection of choral works. That's on the 17th of February at 11 o'clock, and you can log on from the website. You can register from the website. Thank you very much. I will say goodbye and Happy New Year to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally.
Bye-bye.
Bye.